Well, good morning. Welcome to New Life. Thank you so much for choosing to spend part of your Sunday morning with us. We know we say this all the time, but we really do mean it. There are other places you could be, other things you could be doing this morning. You chose to be here with us. We just don't ever take that for granted. So thank you so much for trusting us with an hour or so of your Sunday morning. We are at the very beginning. Some of you, this is the first time you've been here. We are at the very beginning of a very long series of messages called The Jesus Project. I won't tell you how long the series is going to last, just in case it scares you off. But those of you who know, you know we're going to be in this for a little while. We are attempting as best as we can to walk through all of the Gospels and touch on everything that Jesus said and everything that Jesus did that we have recorded in those four Gospels, so that as best as we can, we learn who Jesus is, not who we want Jesus to be and who we have created Jesus to be for ourselves, but really who he actually is, what he said, what he did, and what that means for us as we try to follow him, no matter where we are in that journey. So some of us are at the very beginning stages of trying to follow Jesus, or just trying to understand what it would mean to follow Jesus. And others of us have been following Jesus for a very long time. We've been years and years and years of our lives trying to learn who Jesus is and follow after him. But what we think is that no matter where we are, no matter how long we've been at this, we can all benefit from this really fresh look at the things that Jesus said and the things that Jesus did. Most of us, to some extent or another, we are fascinated with this art or science of prediction. We like the idea that someone somewhere has a little bit of a glimpse ahead into the future, and they could tell us something about what is going to happen. In fact, we spend a lot of time, we spend a lot of effort, we spend a lot of energy on trying to understand what is going to happen next. And we do this in a lot of different areas. We do it in areas from like big, global, massive, universal sorts of things. Like for as long, I think, as humans have been around, we have figured out when the end of the world is going to come. Right? Like, you know, we've had all different theories. If you grew up in church like I did, there were all different theories about when the end of the world was going to happen. You know, it was supposed to happen in 2000, and then I don't know, I think the Mayans said it was like going to be 2012 or something like that. There's like this whole thing, like we've got like, everybody's got an idea about when the world is going to end. We had, you know, predictions about, you know, when global pandemics were going to start, end, finish, middle of, you know, all that sort of stuff. We went through that whole nonsense where everybody had an idea about what was going to happen next, right? Every couple of years, we as, you know, Americans, we get caught up in this election cycle and we try to predict, right, what's going to happen. And you watch TV, some of you hours and hours and hours of TV and listening to other people tell you what's going to happen. And then on the day that the election happens, you find that it didn't happen the way they predicted it was going to. It's this weird thing, right? Like human behavior is really, really difficult for us to predict. If you're like me, you know, for about 5 months every fall into around this time, you go home from church and you sit down on the couch and you know, turn on a pregame football show, and the pregame, you know, commentators will tell you everything that's going to happen that day in all of the games that are going to be played. They have an idea, and then you watch the games and you realize none of the things that they thought were going to happen. In fact, if you had asked them 5 months ago about who was going to be playing these games today, they would have had totally different answers. They had no idea. No one has any clue. No one has any idea. No one has any understanding of what the future looks like. And yet, for us, the future is a fascinating place. It's this, you know, we sort of have this, you know, human obsession with what's coming next. What happens, and who can give us a little bit of insight, who can give us a little bit of a sliver, a little bit of a slice into what the future is going to look like. And religions around the world have prophets who they think tell them what the future looks like. And in fact, just about every religion that I know of has some group of prophets or prophetesses or people that they feel like have some sort of wisdom and insight into the future. And some of them are really just good guesses, and some of them are charlatans who use their prophetic ability to gain some attention and maybe even some money for themselves. And every once in a while, it feels like you stumble across something that seems like they actually did have a glimpse of the future. And it's this weird thing because we as human beings, we're fascinated with the future. We're fascinated with this, this thing that's going to happen down the road. We're fascinated with trying to find somebody who can help us see what is coming next. And yet, when someone tells us what's coming next, we don't necessarily buy it. And then again, we've seen the rise and fall of all these different prophets. This person had this idea, this person had that idea, and they all didn't have any idea. Yet one of the things that you find in Scripture when we look to it is that over and over again, the writers of Scripture claim to have some sort of insight into the future. They have some sort of vision of what is going to happen next. And most often when we think about that kind of what's next, the future's a fascinating place, we look at the Old Testament, we want to look at it and say, well, this prophet said this, and then this is exactly what happened, and this was spoken, and this is how it was fulfilled. And most often, it's interesting, there are not a lot of moments like that in the Old Testament. There's not a lot of moments where it says, this is what's going to happen, and then you can point to some place in the New Testament or even in our current world, current reality, where that thing actually happens. More often, what you find is that the Old Testament, those scriptures that those New Testament writers were drawing from as they told the story of Jesus, it told the story of Israel, it told the story of God's people moving in a certain direction, and they said, I want you, if you read and understand the story, then I want you to understand that this is all moving towards an almost inevitable conclusion. And the inevitable conclusion that it's moving towards is God himself coming to his people to rescue, to restore, and redeem them. And so when you look at the Old Testament, a lot of times we say, well, Jesus came and he fulfilled all of the Old Testament scriptures. Well, I think that's true, but I don't necessarily think it's exactly in the way that we like to think about it, where it says, no one said this is what Jesus is going to look like, so that they could recognize him when he came. No one said this is what Jesus is going to talk like and sound like so that they would recognize him when he came. But what they showed is the shape of the way that God interacts with his people. And they showed the shape of the way that God moves and speaks and responds to and initiates with his people, so that when Jesus showed up, they could recognize him for who he was when he came. Last week, we saw the story of the wise men who had no access to any of those prophecies. They had no access to any of the scriptures. They just followed a star. They're just stargazers, astrologers who come into the city of Jerusalem. They say to King Herod, a king has been born, the king of the Jews. Where's the one who's been born, king of the Jews? Herod consults the scriptures and the prophecies and says, well, in this place, in Bethlehem, this little town, you go outside there and you'll find him. And you go and worship him and come back and bring me word once you have worshiped him, so that I too may go and worship him. We sort of left it last week with the wise men, these magi, these astrologers, going to the place where Jesus was, bowing down, worshiping him, giving him their gifts, and then we sort of closed the curtain because that was all we had time for last week. So we'll pick up the story this week in Matthew chapter 2, verse 13. And now, when they, the wise men, had departed from Bethlehem, from the town where Jesus was, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was, and this is what we'll find in this passage that we're going to read from this morning. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. One of the things that Matthew does, especially at the beginning of his story of Jesus' life, is he wants to make sure that we understand that Jesus doesn't just show up on the scene unannounced out of nowhere, that Jesus actually comes from this whole story of the world that has gone on before him, and particularly from the story of this one group of people, the nation of Israel, and particularly inside of that group of the nation of Israel, he's come from the line of kings. This is who Jesus is. He's not just some random guy that God decided, hey, let's just throw down my son here in the middle of this mess. He actually came up from the story of people like us, real people like you and like me. Real problems, real issues, real concerns like you. and like me. And over again, what you find in Matthew's story is he'll use a phrase like this. This happened, or this took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. We've already actually seen a little bit of that in Matthew's story in the few times that we've gone through it. And here's another place. And in fact, 3 times in just these 10 verses that we're going to read together this morning, you're going to hear some phrase very similar to this. This happened. Joseph had a dream. Joseph rises up in the middle of the night, takes Mary, and says, we got to get out of here. Because once Herod understands that the wise men are not coming back, and once Herod understands that the wise men have sort of deceived him, his response is going to be violent. The way that Herod responds is going to be exactly the way that we would expect Herod to respond if a rival king was escaping from his kingdom. And so Joseph says, we got to get up, we got to move, we got to go several months' journey probably by the time that Mary, Joseph, and Jesus finished their journey, depending on how far down into Egypt they went. But like we think about, you go from Israel to Egypt, you look at a map, it's like, we could get in a car and make that drive in a day. We could get on a plane, we can make that flight in a couple of hours. Well, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus don't have planes and cars and, access to all that sort of stuff. They take a months-long journey down into Egypt, and they stay there for a period of time. We'll pick it up in just a minute. And Matthew says this was so that what the prophet had spoken would be fulfilled, so that what the prophet said would happen would happen. And what he does is he quotes from a guy named Hosea, who, if you were here for our Minor Prophet series, you remember him. But if you weren't, then you might not know who that guy is, because he's not one of the more famous prophets. He's one of the minor prophets. He's like one of the, guys that we think are somewhat insignificant. And Matthew seizes on this one verse in the middle of Hosea's prophecy where God says about his people, out of Egypt I called my son. And when Matthew seizes on this one little line from Hosea's prophecy, you know what he does? He does what we tell people all the time not to do. He takes the story completely out of context. This is not, when Hosea writes it, this is not one of those prophecies that all of the, people looked at and said, this is a prophecy about the Messiah. This is a prophecy about God's son. This is actually about the nation of Israel. Nation of Israel, you might remember this story. At a certain point, Jacob leads his people down into Egypt to escape the famine in the land. And while the people are down in the land of Egypt, they begin to multiply, they begin to prosper, they begin to get so large and important and significant that the Pharaoh looks at the people and says, if we don't do something about these Israelites, they're going to overtake the land. And so he enslaves them, puts them in bondage, makes them make bricks. And you might remember this whole story, makes them make bricks. And then when they don't make enough bricks, he tells them, I'm going to take away your straw and you got to go gather it yourself and make more bricks than what you were making before. He's incredibly harsh, incredibly violent, incredibly destructive leader who is bent on annihilating God's people. Sound familiar? And so when Matthew grabs this little piece out of Hosea's story, he's not saying, well, Hosea was having this, vision of God's son coming out of Egypt. He's saying, hey, look, pay attention to the story of the people of God that goes way back to this moment, thousands of years before Jesus shows up, so that when you understand this is who God is, and this is what God always does, he finds his people in their moments of need, and he rescues them out of places like Egypt. Out of Egypt, I have called my son. Out of Egypt, God says, I went down and I found my people who were oppressed. I went down and I found my people who were downtrodden, who were enslaved, and who were in bondage, and I called them to myself out of that place. And when I called them like I call my son. Called their name. And I said, hey, come and follow me into the calling that I have prepared for you. You guys, this nation of Israel, you're going to be the people who show to the world my grace, show to the world my relationship with other people. You are going to be my people. I'm going to love you. I'm going to care for you. And through you, I'm going to show to the world what it looks like to have a relationship with the God of the universe. And that was Israel's calling. It wasn't to be this exclusive group of people who said, hey, we're over here and you guys are over there and you guys kind of don't know how to find your way to God, but we know how to find our way to God. They were meant to actually help other people find their way to God. And over again, they decided to stand over here and say, no, we don't really like to help you find your way to God. And so when Matthew draws on this little line, what he's drawing on is this entire story. It's not just this one little piece. He's saying, I want you to recall the story of God's people. I want you to recall the story of Israel, and I want you to understand that Jesus shows up to fulfill all of Israel's calling. He shows up to do the one thing that Israel kept refusing to do. He shows up to do the one thing that Israel stopped doing, even though God said, this is the reason I called you, not to make you exclusive, not to make you feel better about yourselves. I called you so that in calling you, you would show to the world my love, my grace, my mercy, and my redemption. And over again, Israel took all of that stuff for themselves and said, thank you, God, so much for loving us. You must be so lucky to have people like us. Good people like us. Good church-going folks like us. And what Jesus does, and what Matthew's trying to set the stage for, is understand that that was not Israel's calling. Israel's calling was to be grace and mercy broken open for the world around them. And so when Matthew says Joseph took Jesus and Mary down into Egypt and they stayed there for a while, he says, I want you to remember that this is embedded in the story of God's people. And here's how he continues. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, which is what we would have expected. And he sent, and this is, again, you think this is extreme. He sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was, and here's that phrase again, then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel, who was the husband of Jacob, weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. Herod responds in the way that Herod responds to just about everything. We talked a little bit about his tendencies last week, but again, just to remind you, if you missed it last week, this is the kind of guy who, in order to consolidate his power, had his mother-in-law's family, and he had multiple wives, but the mother-in-law of his favorite wife, if you could say it that way, the mother-in-law of his favorite wife, he had her entire family killed. Because when he came to power, they had been in power, and he didn't want any of them to get any ideas about trying to come back and use their daughter to get back into power and sort of push him out of the way. So he just killed them all. Really nice guy. Said it last week, but again, in case you missed it, this was a guy who, when he thought that his sons were conspiring against him, he has them assassinated. Because he's a great dad. He's a really good guy. He just loves his children so much. Doesn't want them to take his throne. Doesn't want them before he dies. Maybe I'll pass it on to them someday, but you're not going to get it until it's my time, until I've got squeezed every last drop out of my power and out of my authority. Rome loves Herod because Herod's just like them. He's ruthless and skilled And when he finds out that the wise men didn't come back like he thought they were going to, his response is to go down to Bethlehem with his army and kill all the baby boys under 2 years old. This is why we can kind of believe that the wise men probably weren't there at the manger with the shepherds and stuff, because when Herod finally gets word, it's 2 years later that this is what's happened. Wise men are gone. Jesus is gone. Herod sends soldiers into Bethlehem and the village around it and just massacres babies. Great guy. Then was fulfilled, Matthew says, this line in the prophet Jeremiah. It's in Jeremiah chapter 31. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. And what we would expect if we were to go back and read Jeremiah 31 is we would expect to see some story about the massacre of these baby boys, but that's not actually what we find when we go back to Jeremiah chapter 31. What we find is a story of God's people being dragged away into exile again, being dragged away from their homeland, from their temple, from their religious worship, from their families, from their friends, dragged off into exile to live in slavery and in bondage once again. I don't find this exact, well, here's exactly how this story is going to play out. What Matthew does, he's really creative in the way that he uses these Old Testament texts. It says, I want you to feel like what it felt like to live in these moments. Because we are living in a moment like this, Matthew says. When we saw Jesus, we were living in a moment like this. And essentially what he's saying is people for as long as we can remember have been living in moments like this. It goes way back. Herod's not the first ruthless king who ever tried to kill babies in Israel's history. In fact, if you go all the way back to that Exodus story, you might remember the story of another baby boy who the Pharaoh had said, we're going to wipe out these Hebrews. We're going to wipe out these Israelites. We're going to kill every baby boy that is born. Sends word to the midwives, the Egyptian midwives. When you find a Hebrew baby boy, kill him. It's horrible. It's awful. It is ruthless, and it is violent. And there's one mother, you may remember this story, in that whole nation of Israel who says, not mine. Not mine. And she hides her little baby in a basket, sends him off in the river, and that baby is Moses. Might remember Moses. Moses grows up to become this great deliverer of God's people, this great rescuer. He's the one who goes to the Pharaoh and says, you let my people go. This is what our God says to you. This is who our God is. Our God is a rescuing and redeeming God. Our God is a God who walks down into the middle of our suffering, walks down into the middle of our slavery, into the middle of our bondage, into the middle of a world where kings and pharaohs and people in power will do whatever they can to hold on to their power. Our God is a God who walks into the middle of that world and rescues broken, messed up, fractured, enslaved, and bondaged people like us. Our God is a God who sends a man like Moses to rescue his people. And so what Matthew does, again, really creative little use of his text here. He tells us, hey, Jesus, when he shows up, doesn't just fulfill what Israel was supposed to do, he fulfills what Moses did. Moses comes and gives this law to the people. Moses comes and gives this covenant to the people. Moses comes and leads them out of their slavery, but it's not just Moses, it's Moses under God's direction. And Moses is the one who goes up on the mountain, and Moses is the one who says, this is the way that we are meant to relate to our God. Moses is the one who actually tells Israel, hey, this isn't just about you. It's about you for the good and the beauty of the world that God is sending you into. And Jesus shows up to fulfill this specific calling of a guy named Moses who was hidden from a violent, oppressive king who was bent on murdering children like him. And then, here's how the story closes. Herod eventually dies. When Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, rise, take the child and his mother, and go back to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in the place of his father Herod, the one son that he didn't kill, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that, and here's that phrase again one last time, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. And Joseph, when the time comes and Herod dies, has this dream, this vision. An angel appears to him and says, hey, it's time for you to go back home. Goes back, assuming maybe he was going to go back to Bethlehem. That's where he had left from. But Bethlehem is really close to Jerusalem. And when he finds out that Herod's son is still in power, he thinks, well, maybe this is not the best place for me, because maybe somehow someone remembers our story. Maybe someone somehow remembers how we got here, and maybe someone somewhere passes along some news to Herod's son, and Herod's son comes looking for us. And so, warned in a dream, he withdraws to a little village called Nazareth, way up in the Galilee region, way out of Herod's way, way out of Jerusalem's way. And he settles in this little village, probably just, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 dozen people that lived in the little city of Nazareth. It's a little tiny place. So that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. And here's the interesting thing. You can look through all of the prophets and you will not find anything that resembles this line that Matthew quotes. You trust me, I did it. If you want to do it, you can as well, but I think you can trust me. There's no place in the entirety of all of the prophets that says Jesus would be called a Nazarene. It just doesn't exist. And so Matthew takes this and says this was spoken, this was so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. And we look in the Old Testament and we don't find anything where it says the Messiah would be called a Nazarene. It just doesn't exist. I know I'm not supposed to say that because I'm a pastor. I'm supposed to be like, no, this is exact, I'm supposed to twist it around and make sure that you get it and understand it. But it doesn't exist. It's not there. And so then we've got to try to understand, what is Matthew trying to tell us? What's he trying to say to us about this Jesus who would be called a Nazarene? Here's my best guess. I know, again, I'm supposed to tell you my authoritative, this is absolutely what it means. But I won't do that because it'll be a little dishonest for me. I'll tell you what I think. I think that what you find when you read through the prophets is this overwhelming sense that when God sends his Messiah, his anointed one into the world, he would be a person that other people would overlook. He would be a person that when people look at him, there would be nothing about him physically, his appearance, or his credentials, or any of those sorts of things that would tell and announce to the world, this is the Messiah. That over and over again, what you find in the prophets is that they would find that when the Messiah shows up, he would be despised and rejected by men, that they would look at him. He would have no form or loveliness, that we should be drawn to him, that he would be abused, he would be mocked, he would be scorned, he would be overlooked, that people would look at him and would say, how could anything good come from a place like that? How could anyone of any reputation, any significance, any importance, or any meaningfulness come from a place like Nazareth? He would be a Nazarene, a byword, an overlooked, not important, not significant enough kind of person. And yet, that would be the one that God would use to restore his people. I think what Matthew is saying is that Jesus comes, I think we'll find this throughout the rest of his story. Jesus comes to fulfill the Messiah's calling. This is why he's here. Brings the story of Israel to its conclusion. Comes to stand for his people like Moses did. And comes to be the rescuer and redeemer, not just of Israel, not just of God's chosen people, but comes to be the rescuer and redeemer of the world. And he does it from a place that's completely obscure, that no one thought was likely to produce the Messiah. That no one thought this is where Messiah should come from. This is where kings come from. Well, kings come from Jerusalem. Messiahs come from religious places where they've got all the impeccable credentials. And Jesus doesn't come from any of those places. And yet, he comes to bring all of the law and all of the prophets to their conclusion. Comes to bring that whole story, all of that stuff that you look at in the Old Testament, you're like, why is this stuff even here? Like, why do I care about Jacob and Joseph and Moses and Abraham and Sarah and all of these people and all these weird, obscure things that happened to them? And why do I care about all of these laws? And why do I care about what all of these prophets said? And why is all of this stuff significant and all of this stuff important? And Matthew says it's because when Jesus came, he would draw all of that stuff to its conclusion. He would bring all of those little pieces, all of those little threads, all of those little stories together into this one place. And he would stand at the end of this line and he would say, this is how God interacts with his people. This is how God moves in response to the need of his people. And Matthew spends a whole bunch of time on this stuff. And you might think, well, this is insignificant, it's unimportant, let's just get to the good stuff. Let's get to the healing stuff, and let's get to the miracles, and let's get to the great teachings, and let's get to all those cool things that I remember, all of those Bible stories that I remember from Sunday school. But Matthew says, hey, before we get to all of that stuff, I want you to understand what the foundation of the story looks like. It's important for you to understand what is underneath the story of Jesus, so that when you get to the full story of Jesus, you actually appreciate what has been built on top of it. Here's what I think, and again, this is maybe the way that I see it. I think that what Matthew does in this little passage, this little 10-verse section, is he lays down some foundation work underneath the house. And you know what? If you ever build a house, anybody built a house? Yes? No? Yeah, some of you have. When you build a house and you show off your house to all of your friends who come over, do you go down to the basement and say, look at this beautiful foundation? I mean, this is spectacular. This concrete it's just gorgeous, isn't it? It's not the stuff, it's not the stuff that you're like, hey, come over and see all of the work that's been done. You show off, the carpet, you show off the woodwork, or you show off the countertops or the kitchen or the bathroom or whatever it is that's your favorite room of the house. No one's like, oh, let's go look at the foundation. Can't wait to spend some time down in the basement. And yeah, you understand this, right? If that's not there, then all of the other cool stuff that's built on top of it doesn't exist. It just falls apart. And so Matthew's doing a little bit of work in these 10 verses to say, hey, don't miss the foundation of Jesus' story. Before we get to all the cool stuff, baptism and temptation, all that stuff that's coming next, don't miss this important piece, which is that Jesus came from the story of God's people. And he came to bring that story to its conclusion. And he came to rescue people like you and like me. Now we'll pray, and then we'll sing as we close. Jesus, I am grateful that all of those threads of all of those stories, which are sort of all over the place for us, some of which we remember, some of which we've forgotten, some of which feel unimportant to us, that in your way of telling the story, they are not unimportant, they're not insignificant. That you lay inside of our hearts this foundational work that says this is the kind of God that we serve. We serve a God who reaches down into our darkest places, gives us hope, gives us future, redeems and rescues people like us, gives us courage to turn around into a broken and hurting world and be light and grace and hope for the people around us. And so, God, I pray that we would absorb the full weight of that story into our hearts. And as we build on top of it, that we would build something that honors you, glorifies you. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.